When you hear the word slavery, what comes to mind? What is your definition of slavery? It's most likely based on slavery in the States in the 1700s and the 1800s, ending in the Civil War, race-based, no way out, you're a slave till you die, no advancing yourself, your children are slaves, your grandchildren are slaves, perpetual race-based slavery. If that's what comes to mind, you read the New Testament, you're absolutely going to not get why Paul and others don't condemn this from the very beginning. So I'm going to very rapidly give you the information that you need. In both systems, the person is a piece of property who is actually owned by another person. That's bad. In both systems, children born to slaves are slaves. In both systems, there was often kidnapping involved in order very purposefully to sell someone into slavery. Now, in the first century, this was done through pirates mostly, or prisoners of war. Those are the similarities. Let's look at some huge differences. Slavery was not race-based in any way, had nothing to do with the color of your skin. This was not a homogenous group of people who were slaves. Slaves were of all kinds of people from the north, south, east, and west, all over the Roman Empire. Slaves made up the majority of the Roman Empire. At one point in time, it was estimated that 85% of people in Rome and on the Italian peninsula were slaves. Rather than discouraging education, education was actually encouraged because the slave was then able to do a better service for their master. So there were doctors who were slaves, there were lawyers, there were accountants, there were people who had a high level of expertise, education, and experience who were slaves, unlike the American system of slavery. In many instances in first century Greco-Roman slavery, slaves were often more educated than their own masters. Slaves could own property. Slaves could even own other slaves. Slaves could make contracts and enter into legally binding agreements independent of their owners. Slaves could have a religion independent of their master. Sometimes they had the same religion. Sometimes there were household conversion, which includes servants. You see things like in 1 Peter chapter 2, where Peter talks about how slaves are supposed to live and behave themselves under the midst of intense persecution on the part of their master. And we assume that these are non-Christian masters, right? So the slave has become a Christian, but the master is not, which shows us that slaves could have an independent religious expression from their master. Now here's where it gets really interesting, the advancement of slaves. There was absolutely incentive to become a slave in certain situations and in certain people, unlike American slavery. Slavery was actually a means of economic advancement for yourself. Slaves could work and earn money. Slaves could save their money. Slaves could take that saved money and buy their way back out of slavery to freedom. Now, the price of being bought as a slave was actually less than the price of buying yourself back out. So if you were to sell yourself into slavery, which sounds crazy because we're still thinking of American kind of slavery, why would anyone do that when there's no way out? Well, there was a way out. And people did sell themselves into slavery. It may be that they had to pay a debt. It may be that they needed education. This was like going to college in a sense, like, let me become a slave to someone who can educate me in a particular skill that I can then use for my own advancement and then save up money to buy myself out and continue to maintain the skills and the networks to have a reasonable life. Very much unlike American slavery. So you could buy your way back out of freedom. You could use your enslavement to pay off a debt. This was actually like their form of bankruptcy. So you would have a debt and you would sell yourself into slavery. We see this in the parables at times. And then you could work and earn and pay off that debt and buy yourself back out of slavery and then like clear your debts. This was, again, it's like ancient bankruptcy with freedom at the end. The estimation was that most people were actually freed from slavery by the age of 30. That's in the dictionary of Paul and his letters. So let's say you wanted to get in with a network of the right people. So you would find someone who was in the right network, someone who was a benefactor, a patron who's very wealthy, who had all the right connections and networks. You could sell yourself as a slave to that person, get educated by that person, work with them, get great experience, get into a great network, a social and business network of people that you could then use to your own advantage, earn money, save your money, and buy yourself back out. That's called manumission, when somebody buys themselves out of slavery. Very feasible to get yourself back out. Now, when you had kids as a slave, your kids became slaves. And that was actually, the scholars say that was like the way that most people actually became slaves, was being born into it, which is an unfortunate thing. If you were freed, once you were freed, you were free. It wasn't like if you were African American freed in the South as a slave, and then you're worried about being like recaptured or taken back in. Like legally, your debts were completely crossed out. You had no one looking out for you, no one trying to pull you back in. The children that you had after being freed from being a slave were also completely free. There was no enslaving your children. Again, there's no race-based system to this. And another huge carrot hanging out there for people was if you wanted to become a Roman citizen, often when you were freed as a slave, you were given Roman citizenship. That's why a huge chunk of the Roman population were slaves by the first century. Now, often the owners would actually release their slaves upon their death. So like when they wrote their will, it would have provisions for releasing of the slaves. That didn't really happen as much in the South. In the South, you read wills of people who are slave owners, and you read in their will about who is going to get which slave. They would name the slaves and talk about who is going to get those slaves. In the ancient world, often masters would release their slaves upon their death. Release could even come not even because you bought yourself back out or paid all the price. If you were very faithful to your owner, to your master, then often the master would show you favor by releasing you. Again, most people were free by the age of 30. Now, I also need you to know that life expectancy was much lower, probably in the 40s or 50s. So we have slavery and a whole system of advancement, of debt repayment, of gaining Roman citizenship. There were a lot of advantages to this, getting in the right networks, in the right business field, around the right people, getting networked in a business sense. This is the way that a lot of people did this. This was their end. This was their way from going from absolute, complete, abject poverty into making something of themselves. Slavery was like, I hate to say it's like college. I hate to say it's even like a trade school or something like that, because you were actually owned by the other person. You were not in control of your life. That's not a good thing. Like, that's not just a blessing, but it was a means to an end that people understood. It was very much the way the system worked. We talked about this is kind of like semi-good treatment of slaves by their owners. That was not always the case. The people we're talking about that were in the Bible are mostly people from the Eastern culture. Since the Spartacan rebellions, like Spartacus' rebellion since 73 BC, slaves from the North and the West were treated very poorly. They were thrown into chain gangs. They were put into just manual labor. They were forced to sleep in these little low roof rooms that you couldn't even stand up in. It's kind of like punishment. Even when you try to get up at night, you can't even fully stand up. Those are called ergastulas. Just a horrible treatment of people from the North and the West. They were not trusted. They were just seen as rebellious. In the Old Testament, in Exodus 21:2, slavery was done to pay off debt. Again, this is like their bankruptcy court. In Exodus 22:3, slavery could be used to make reparation for a crime. That was actually another exception to the decent treatment of slaves in the ancient world. Was if you were made a slave because you were caught in a crime, you were often a slave for life. That was punishment, not just making restitution for debt, not just to advance yourself in society. Like you did something bad, you were enslaved for that, and there was not any getting out of that. In Leviticus 25:49 and following, it talks about earning money and paying yourself off as a slave. And again, no longer than 6 years. So it had a time limit to it, kind of like bankruptcy court as we see that today. In 2 Samuel 9:8-9, we see just like in the Greco-Roman world that slaves could even have their own slaves. Now, Paul uses slavery terminology in several places. He talks about our redemption. He talks about us being freed or forgiven from sin and changing ownership or changing lordship from sin to God, like in Romans 6:16, like in Ephesians 1:7-8, like in Colossians 1:13-14. This is all over Paul's writing, is this metaphor of family and of ownership, lordship, slavery metaphors are all throughout. They're in Jesus' parables as well. They're in 1 Corinthians 7. They're in Philemon, where he begs Philemon in verses 14 and 15 that when he accepts Onesimus back, that he doesn't take him back as a slave, but he takes him back as a brother in Christ. There's this sweet passage in 1 Clement 55:2 where it says this: "We know that many among ourselves have delivered themselves to bondage that they might ransom others. Many have sold themselves to slavery, and receiving the price paid for themselves have fed others." That is so beautiful. It is so selfless, compassionate that you had Christians in the ancient world who would sell themselves to a more kind master in order to get the money to buy someone else out of slavery. And actually in the Old Testament, there's a verse that says that you are, if your brother becomes a slave, you are to save up the money and go release free your brother or your sister from being a slave. That's in Leviticus 25:47-48. In the Old Testament, when you released your slave as a slave owner, you were to bless them. You were to pour out blessing upon them. That's in Deuteronomy 14:14-15. That as you release them, remember you were slaves in Egypt. All of you were slaves, so that whenever you release the slaves, bless them, just like the Egyptians blessed you when you left Egypt. In Deuteronomy 23:15, it tells them that if you find a runaway slave, you are not to return them to their master, which is also different than the Greco-Roman world and also different from American slavery. So Jesus never condemned slavery. He never really preached on it in the recorded Gospels, but he did have teaching that would undermine the very heart and soul of what slavery was about. Like when Jesus was asked by Peter, "How often am I to forgive my brother?" Or whenever Jesus talked about repaying a debt, or if someone sues you to take something, don't just give them one piece of clothing, give them more pieces of clothing. Like if you really followed Jesus' rules on forgiveness and restitution, there wouldn't really be a need for slavery because you wouldn't be holding these debts against people. Maybe this is deconstructed the Americanized, horrendous system of slavery that is just so natural to our way of thinking. We think about slavery so that when we read the Bible, we read it through that filter rather than its own filter, its own day and time, its own history, the very real-time happenings that are going on around Paul and others in their world, where people are actually entering into slavery for their own advancement. If you're like, oh, no more slaves, do away with slavery, it's almost like you're doing away with trade school or college or like systems of advancement. And yes, I say that carefully because these people were owned. They lost control of their own lives, but there were means and mechanisms for them to get back out and typically out in a better position if you work this correctly than when you came in, which is the whole incentive of getting in the first place. Becoming a Roman citizen, finding new networks of people for business, becoming educated in a skill or a trade. So it's a whole different system. I hope this helps you in your faith. So when you read those passages, you're just like, okay, I get why Paul would not have just said, okay, the whole system needs to go, because this actually helped pull some people out of poverty. This actually helped bring restitution for debt. Like instead of killing someone for your debt, there was a means to keep you alive and actually advance you and maybe even gain you citizenship through the repaying of that debt. So this is the scoop on it. Now you know the details. Whatever you do with it's up to you, but I just beg you to continue to study. I beg you to continue to dig, get into the Word of God. Don't take my word for it, but just keep studying, keep praying, keep looking. Love you, appreciate you. And hit that like button and leave a comment. Is this eye-opening to you? Have you ever heard this before? Well, here it is. God bless. See you soon.